Um, yeah, so just appreciate everyone taking the time to be here. This came out of really naturally out of a conversation and a real appetite to talk about this intersection between housing and environment and climate in some different spaces that I'm in, including the Minnesota Environmental Partnership Climate Cluster. So we're just really excited to be here and have a conversation. It's a little bit on the less formal side because we just want to hear from some experts, and we have left ample time for questions at the end to have a discussion if that happens, and if not, we can just end it early. But I think there's a lot of interest in a lot of folks here from lots of different organizations. So clearly there's yeah, just a real appetite to dig into the details here. So we are going to hear from Ben, Libby, and Brian in that order. Ben is my colleague at Fresh Energy, Director of Building Performance. So he's well-versed on codes and buildings and how buildings can be a part of our climate solution. So I think I'll hand it over to Ben, and then, yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat, raise your hand. Panelists, if you have questions for each other, feel free to kind of note those, and we'll get into those after all three of you have spoken. Yeah, hand it over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Anna. I am going to share some slides. Do you want me to do it, Anna, or do you want to do it?
You can go ahead and do it. I think
okay.
That should work now.
Okay. All right, now let me get you all situated so I can see you. All right. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for being here. As folks mentioned, a lot of my work at Fresh Energy revolves around the building code, the code adoption process, advocating for a stronger building code, which has a lot of ties to housing. Right. There we go. Okay, so have a few slides here to share. Basically, kind of what the code process has been in Minnesota over time. How much does the energy code save? Where do we sit compared to our peers, and a legislative initiative we've been working on to move us forward. So first of all, we'll kind of this graphic shows where the building code has been in Minnesota over time. So you can see we've made substantial progress on the building code, reducing overall energy use since the 70s. So the building code in some ways is made a lot of improvement, but we're somewhat limited in what we're able to address because it's really set out there to be an energy efficiency tool resulting from the energy crisis of the 1970s. So it's a very useful tool for things like energy efficiency. It's not as useful for things like fuel switching or electric vehicle charging and that kind of thing. So again, we've made a lot of progress both in the residential and commercial space. And given this conversation specifically around housing, it's multifamily housing lives in a really kind of weird area in the code, in that buildings 4 stories or higher adhere to the commercial energy code, while buildings 3 stories and lower adhere to the residential building code. So I think it's really important that we talk about both, especially when we're talking about multifamily housing. One thing I'll also point out about this graphic is that you can see we made a lot of progress over time, but there's a little squiggle on the y-axis. So the bottom is a 40 normalized for normalized energy use, not 0 or 40 EUI for those that are familiar with that term. So there is still a lot of work that we can do.
Hey, Ben, do you mind if I jump in? We had a request to explain the acronyms in the chart, if you don't mind doing that.
Yes. Okay. And you can also see that it has changed over time. Happy to do so. So there are a couple different groups that provide model codes for states to adopt. One is ASHRAE, and the other is ICC, which produces the IECC Prior basically to 2000, Minnesota had its own energy code that was written at a state level. So MEC is the Minnesota Energy Code. And beginning in the 90s, we started adopting this model codes that we then amend at the state level. And as a little more background, Minnesota statutorily adopts the building code every 6 years, and that process is convened through the Department of Labor and Industry. Any other questions before moving on? Cool. All righty then. So this graphic is a little old and from our and it was designed by our friends at the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. But basically, I put it here to show that there's big number savings that come from updating your energy code. So just in the last we've got some timings in there. Decade or so, we're seeing almost 1 million tons of carbon savings through the building energy code. That just comes from savings in new buildings. All right, so kind of situating Minnesota compared to our peers, I usually describe it as we're in the middle of the pack. The Michigan and Illinois are typically a little ahead of us. Some states are behind. I used to be able to poke fun at Wisconsin, but they're moving forward a little faster than us. And you can see some states like the Dakotas, Missouri, and Kansas do not adopt a statewide code. Rather, cities adopt codes on an individual basis, versus Minnesota, where the state is required to have one overarching code that applies to the whole state, which in its current iteration prohibits Minnesota from having something like a stretch code, where cities could have a stronger building code than the statewide code. That we'll get into a little more here. All right, so many of you I know are familiar with the initiative to advance our commercial energy code to reach net zero by 2036. This is a bill that Fresh Energy has worked on for the last few legislative sessions, and the prior to that, we worked on a bill that actually would require a stretch code. So what we found is that it's a lot more amenable to different stakeholder groups than instead of having a code that would allow cities to kind of go above and beyond, to let's just move the whole state forward. So this basically would tip the angle of our energy code and drive it down to net zero energy by 2036. So you can see that in this chart, the Minnesota Energy Code terminology has reappeared, in that we would, in a sense, have our own energy code that would be different than the model codes. And this proposal would be similar to SB 2030 for those who are familiar with that program that applies to government bonding bills and buildings in St. Paul, just on a little bit of a different time zone or timing. Along with that, we also this bill would require changing our code on a 3-year cycle rather than a 6-year cycle. So with that, I'll see if there are any questions. I'm not sure if that beat meant that I'm low on time or that or it was something else randomly, but happy to take questions now or take them at the end.
Yeah, Ben, I just have a quick question, if you don't mind. Can you give like a quick primer on why the building code is important, and kind of how much of our carbon emissions are due to building use, to sort of ground us?
Oh,
yes,
yes,
a little
yes.
bit.
I should have mentioned that up front. So about 40% of our carbon emissions and energy use come from the built environment. That includes the electricity we use to light and the energy we use in our house, and for those who have electric heating, as well as the natural gas for heating there. The building energy code focuses mostly on new construction. So these are the newest buildings, which provide the greatest opportunity for the most cutting edge technology. So Fresh Energy really sees this as a way to kind of bring the building stock up a notch, in knowing that older building stock is a lot harder to tackle for a lot of reasons. Ooh, Sean's got a question, it looks like.
Thank you.
Hey there, Ben. I'm curious. I know there were maybe about 20 cities working on the voluntary stretch building code for this idea of having a statewide code improvement. There was an idea of maybe adopting the federal building efficiency standards more rapidly.
Mhm.
And then it sounds like maybe there's another idea of Minnesota coming up with its own statewide building standard that would be independent of the federal one. Like, what's the difference? Or, like, which way?
Yeah. So it's a little complicated in that we would still adopt the ASHRAE model standard, but then would be statutorily required to up the efficiency by a certain percentage each 3 years to keep us on track to getting to that net zero target by 2036. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then it's part of it kind of gets into, you can up the standard, but then for the residential and commercial buildings, what would be the building techniques or technologies that would enable them to meet that? And I'm not sure whether you have to have different engagement of home builders and whoever commercial property real estate people to get them on board with the technologies and building techniques to meet those increased standards.
Yeah, there are definitely there's sorry, just tackling two separate questions here. Okay, so so what, I guess I should have mentioned this, maybe there's this moving from the individual city stretch code to this proposal was a result of a stakeholder group convened within the commercial energy building space on how we can get there. And the takeaway from that group is that having a statewide standard is much more amenable. I think the part of this reason this graphic is so helpful is that we know we can do it because this trajectory follows the SB 2030 program, which has been well tested throughout the state. And so we know the techniques that will be required to get us there, and we know the additional costs. We know that they're well within the cost effectiveness window, so they'll pay back in less than 12 years for a new building, which is a very good deal given that building is going to be there a lot longer than that. So it's really just kind of using a policy tool to push the market.
So then this would be for residential, this would be like 4 stories and above. And then for the residential side of the efficiency, is there anything in pathway on that on the residential side?
It is not included in this current proposal for a lot of reasons. The commercial pathway is a little bit easier. It's more politically palatable. So we've chosen to focus on commercial for now, but that wouldn't exclude something similar on the residential side being available in the future, being kind of a follow-up piece of legislation down the road.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the question, Sean. I hope to clarify a few things. So I think we'll save additional questions for the end, and appreciate you. And we'll switch to Libby now. Libby Murphy is the Director of Policy at Minnesota Housing Partnership. And she is going to talk about the overlap between, affordable housing and buildings that work and are healthy and supportive to people in the climate.
Thanks, Anna. Again, so I'm Libby, Director of Policy at Minnesota Housing Partnership. So for those of you who are less familiar with MHP, we work statewide as well as nationally, providing direct technical assistance for communities that are looking to improve home and the conditions of community. And so we do that work primarily based here in Minnesota, but also that work is national. And then I work on our state policy. I'm lobby at the state legislature, and my colleague Elizabeth Glidden, who is on this call as well, focuses on our federal policy, and we also do some local engagements as well. So I just kind of wanted to start because Anna asked me to talk about how housing and housing stability are related to energy efficiency and building performance. Increased energy performance results in lower energy bills for low-income households, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important. But it also results in improved indoor air quality, safety, and comfort. And so it can have a huge benefit on both health as well as just general quality of life for residents. And it's not only imperative to think about the immediate health and quality of life issues, but as we think about climate change and the communities, under-resourced communities and communities of color that are disproportionately experiencing the harm of climate change and things like droughts, severe heat waves, flooding, and heavy rains. We're going to have to think about the impacts, and especially the racial equity impacts for these communities. I think it's important to ground, because I'm going to talk about housing cost burden and energy burden and what exactly that means. In the world of affordable housing, we talk a lot about housing cost burden, because when you're paying too much for housing, that often means that you don't have stable housing. You're in a precarious situation, you're possibly in jeopardy of experiencing homelessness or experiencing homelessness. So housing cost burden, when I say that, I mean households who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, and that includes utilities. A household that is severely cost burdened is spending half or more of their income on housing, on rent, as well as their utilities. Included, but different, is this energy cost burden. So included in your housing cost burden is those utility payments. But when we talk specifically about energy cost burden, it's the percent of median yearly income that a household might pay for electricity and gas bills. If a household is paying more than 6% on energy bills, that's considered a high energy burden, and more than 10% is considered to be severe energy burden. And to put that in perspective, the average Minnesotan pays 2% of their annual household income on electricity and gas bills. And it's important to think about that because there are over 100,000 Minnesotans, lowest income residents, households making around 30% or of area median income or lower. So that means roughly 28,000 or less for a household of 4. These are the households who have the least amount of options available to them that are both affordable and available. We produce the fewest number of units that are affordable to these households. And I'll get into that when I talk about some of the opportunities this legislative session. But that means when people can't find housing that is affordable to them, we're forcing people to live in unsafe and unstable housing situations and potentially homelessness. And housing costs are increasing. Between 2000 and 2019, the median renter income in Minnesota increased by 1%, while the median gross rent increased by 14%. And it's Indigenous households and households of color in every part of the state that are paying too much for housing as compared to white Minnesotans. And it's low wealth households and communities of color that consistently face disproportionately higher energy burdens. In Minnesota, are extremely low income residents, those that are at 30% of area median income, have an energy burden of roughly 13%. That's higher than the severe energy burden threshold. And again, the average Minnesotan is paying 2% of their annual income on energy. And what this means in real dollars is for a household of 4, again, making 30% of median income, that's just under $28,000. If they are experiencing severe energy burden, meaning they're spending 10% of their income on gas and electricity, they're spending $2,795 on an annual basis on utilities. If they were spending 2% like the average Minnesota household family, they would be spending $559 for gas and electricity. That's a $2,200 difference that a family could save if they were living in housing that was more energy efficient and in buildings that were performing better. That is substantial for a household for a low-income household. So reducing energy burden has meaningful impact on people. Anna also asked me to talk about the latest findings on a report that we did in partnership with Fresh Energy and a whole host of other partners, where we looked at a piece of legislation around the Better Building Code that was introduced in 2021. This legislation would require new commercial buildings, including multifamily buildings that are 4 stories or greater. So Ben mentioned that those are treated as commercial buildings and are subject to a slightly different code, and he knows the specifics around that. But so it would require these multifamily buildings of 4 stories or greater to have increasingly higher standards for energy efficiency until they reach net zero energy by 2036. And a study that was conducted this past summer found that reducing energy costs for tenants and owners would result from the Better Building Code by 2024, would translate into an estimated annual savings of about $319 for households just within that short period of time. So that is a piece of legislation that is at the legislature and has the potential to have an immediate impact for households. I think another interesting part of this study that MHP worked on, along with Community Stabilization Project, the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Fresh Energy, the New American Development Center, Bloomberg Philanthropies, American Cities Climate Change, and Natural Resources Defense Council, was this race equity impact assessment that really spurred the report that's currently being finalized. But the study really found, the report findings reflect that structural systems withhold equitable energy and housing resources for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people and other economically marginalized communities. Black and Brown residents in particular have the most to lose from failure to provide energy efficient buildings, and they're disproportionately experiencing harm from climate change, environmental pollution, and general poor housing quality. And when we examined the stock of 4+ story multifamily buildings, there's some interesting things that we found through that study, and that also tell us why this piece of legislation would have an immediate impact, especially on our under-resourced households. So people of color, in particular Black and Latinx, are disproportionately living in areas that are zoned for multifamily. And 40% of all multifamily affordable homes are located in buildings with 4 or more stories in Minnesota. And so there's a significant number of households that would benefit from the changes that are proposed in the Better Building Code. And it's actually interesting. So while most of those properties are in the 7-county metro, a significant number, 42% of greater Minnesota 4+ story multifamily properties are affordable. So a lot of the affordable homes in greater Minnesota are in these types of properties that would be impacted by that. I think some other things of note that are interesting that were part of the community engagement that the team did as a part of this report. They directly engaged with residents as well as housing providers, and they heard from residents that quality of life, health, and finances are profoundly impacted by housing quality. So we were told stories of households having to move because every apartment that they moved to that they could afford had a mold issue and somebody had an allergy to mold. Or if the heat went out or there's an issue with heating, they would have to buy space heaters. And remember how much these households are already spending on rent and energy. They're already severely energy burdened, already severely housing cost burdened. We also heard consistently from residents that the same standards should apply to all types of buildings. Focusing resources solely on new construction or certain just single family as opposed to multifamily can exacerbate disparities for low wealth in communities of color. And we heard consistently as well that race, income, and neighborhood too often determine one's access to energy efficient homes. And so there's an issue about access and opportunity. And there's a lack of enforcement mechanisms to meet the current need. So we heard consistently from renters that they're not in the, whereas homeowners can make choices and changes to their homes, renters cannot, and they have to work through a property management company or through an owner to make changes And when they're, especially when they're very low income, one of the moving may not result in better housing quality. You may face mold again, or another issue related to poor energy efficiency or building performance. And some of the things that we heard from property managers and developers was that resources for affordable multifamily must be matched to the regulatory requirements. So currently, it takes sometimes 13 different funding tools to develop a multifamily apartment complex. And each of those 13 sources may have different requirements to meet different public policy objectives. And so developers feel as if they're struggling as is. And so really thinking about the resources that are needed to match whatever requirements are being added and to achieve greater energy efficiency. And that also, as we think about these 4+ story multifamily, these are buildings that are already vulnerable, a vulnerable property class from the 1960s and 70s primarily, that have a whole host of other unique investment needs that are coming up in the next 10 to 30 years. So thinking about this housing stock as being vital in terms of the number of affordable units that it provides, but also other pressing needs that are going to require a financial commitment. And then just thinking about this next legislative session where the opportunity is bonding. This is a bonding year. Bonding is the most important resource that we have to develop housing that is affordable for our lowest income households. There's no other tool really federally or at the state level that target households at 30% of median income or lower. And so a big bonding bill is needed. And over the past several years, there are more and more eligible uses, but the pot hasn't grown. So we need to think about a very large investment around housing infrastructure bonds. There's also significant supplemental budget resources that are going to be available. We have $1.2 billion in federal money that's going to be available, as well as the state has a general fund surplus. And so these are resources that can be used for new constructions and for rehab, in particular, of these older multifamily housing stock properties. And then I'll just say this, so I think there's a lot of opportunity in the Energy Committee this next session, especially with those federal funds. I know there's things that are happening around pre-weatherization for single family homes, the Better Building Code being up again. But one thing to look out for is that there are policies that are supported by both Republicans and some Democrats about looking at how to reduce the cost on all new building. And some of what they're pointing at is around the energy code, and Ben can speak more eloquently to that, but they put some narrow time constraints on it when updated codes need to pay for themselves. So at first it was 5 years. They need to be paid off within 5 years, and then 7 years. And I think the latest proposal by a Democrat is 30 years. And I don't know enough about that to know if that's a reasonable time, but regardless, those are things that are out there and that will be moving forward this next session.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Libby. You just covered a lot and grounded us in a lot of different aspects of this conversation. So thank you so much. I think we will pause there or not take questions right now unless there's something quick and pressing among the group. Okay, hearing none, we'll switch to Brian. Thanks again, Libby. Excited to circle back with all three of you to keep the conversation going. Brian, thanks so much for being here. Brian is an architect and is also on the board of MN 350. He built a development in Northfield, and we're excited to hear some specifics around the challenges he encountered related to all the different, challenges from different entities and might lead to some ideas around policy fixes. So I will pass it over to Brian.
Thanks, Anna. We are in the middle of the process. We just started construction on the process around the Hillcrest Project, and First, I'll tell you what it is. It's 17 units of housing, 3 are emergency units, 6 are transitional housing units, and 8 are workforce housing units. And the goal was to make the workforce housing be very affordable. So it's the target rent is about $700 for a 2-bedroom apartment in the project right now. So the total project cost is about 4.8 million. To meet the goals on making it affordable, 2 million is financed, and then 2.8 million had to be done in fundraising. And the fundraising came primarily from community members, and then there was a chunk of money that came from the city of Northfield through the Housing and Redevelopment Authority for the project as well. And we're just about $100,000 from meeting that goal. We started construction on the project just about a month ago. We ended up doing a small subdivision, so the roads are completed, and then foundations have started on 2 units right now. So that's where the project is at. And this shows the location up here just north of Carleton College on 3. So what you saw in that first slide was an old motel site, and that was emergency and transitional housing, and it was deteriorating greatly. It was hard to maintain. So the CAC in 2018 said we need to do something different. And the project did not start out as net zero housing at that point. And what happened was there was a convergence in the community between a climate action plan that occurred in the city of Minneapolis in 2018 and adopted in November of 2019. And at a stakeholders meeting in October of 2019, we were all sitting at a table, and everybody talked about projects that might help meet the goals for the climate action plan with regard to housing. And about 7 of the stakeholders kept bringing up the Community Action Centers project. And so by the end of the meeting, it was kind of like, well, if we can't make this project net zero, how are we ever going to meet the climate action goals? So that was the seed for blending the two. And then at the same time, as we dug into how we would do it, it became clear that we were doing this at a really good time, that there was technology out there, both for design and construction, that would allow us to do it. So we set up some goals to make the project be cutting edge, but not bleeding edge in terms of what the design would be like. And we also, I was the lead designer on the project. We needed to have a project that felt normal, not like a science experiment. So we came up with something that was pretty traditional in terms of how the building looked. And then we had to figure out how to make it work as net zero. Fairly early on, we decided that we were going to do a separate solar array for the project. And again, another convergence happened in the community in that Novel Energy Solutions have been working with Northfield Community Area Solar and had developed some credits by their participation and had funds to work on contributing to a specific project. So we approached them to provide solar for the project that allows us to make it net zero, and discussions and design continued with that. We put together a great team of people that included board members from the CAC, a sustainability manager from Carleton College, Precipitate architects that specialize in passive house design, and the University of Minnesota Center for Sustainable Building Research. And the goal of all of us was, how can we do this using existing codes, which is what we want to do, and then how can we take a building construction that could be adopted by builders in the area that was not unusual. So we created an envelope wall design. It's a double wall system that is pretty conventional in how it's constructed. It allows us to get the frame of the building up there early on, and then there's an interior wall that comes later. And we were surprised. This is a wall system that Precipitate hadn't worked on, but we're actually going to go for a passive house certification for the duplex units, which is about the highest standard that you can do right now in building. And then we were able to do that. The additional cost per unit is somewhere around $8,000 in materials, about $15,000 total per unit to make it net zero. The other thing that was important is that now through the university, there are tools that help designers create wall systems, even though that they're tight, that they won't fail, that are allow us to study thermal bridging within the units to achieve this high level of construction, yet using normal building methods. So these are the challenges that we had. So one of the things that when you get out into the community is selling contractors on working on this. We came up with an approach that said we're actually going to have 3 general contractors constructed so they all could get experience in this. And then that means you're working with a range of different subcontractors. And again, the biggest challenge probably is education of those subcontractors as to why we're doing things the way that are fairly normal, but at a little bit higher level, so that they have to challenge themselves in doing it and convincing them and watching them to make sure that we are doing it. We're going through a DOE Zero Energy Ready, Energy Star, Air Plus, and Excel's new rebate program for the Minnesota Affordable New Housing Construction Program. I have a 3-ring binder that's about 2 inches thick of all the things that we have to do to meet those programs, and to make sure that they're going through a checklist. The Center for Energy and the Environment is actually the official agency that's checking all this against what the contractors are doing. So there's that extra layer that goes on there. Actually, the Excel rebate program that came through provides significant dollars to make that worthwhile doing. So I would say one of the biggest challenges that we have coming up is continuing on the education front. We just were awarded a small CERT grant on the project to follow up with homeowners once they come into the project in 2022 to see what it's like for them to live there. Being very tight buildings, my greatest fear is that we'll end up with 17 households that have smokers that want to open their windows and they can't. So, you know, we need to, again, it'll be a continual education project with the tenants that are living there and understanding, you know, what makes this housing special. But going back to the Libby's discussion, you know, having a solar array that is owned by CAC is a great thing. We actually only have 1 meter in this project with Excel. So we are our own little utility in the project. So the CAC will be able to control hopefully all of the energy costs, because everything is electric. It's air source heat pumps. And the buildings are so tight that the energy to heat and cool the buildings is almost equal to the amount of energy it takes to heat the hot water for domestic use in the building. So they're that tight and that efficient. So I'll finish here and people can ask questions.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's really great to have sort of a real world application of building. Just have a quick question just to clarify. Are you able to open the windows in the unit if people want to, or how does that work?
Yeah, you actually, by code, you have to be able to, there are requirements under the building code for fresh air. So there actually are there is a nice amount of light and air in the units. I'm personally very, light makes a huge difference for me, my mental health and well-being. So the windows are not small. They'll be bright, airy units that the people will be living in there.
Got it. Thank you. So I have a question just to start off. So we know that codes are important for reducing energy or carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions over time. Energy efficiency also makes the unit more affordable to live in. So it just seems like, basic stuff that we should be supporting codes and supporting and creating buildings that meet those two needs. I think I'm under the impression that one of the biggest pushbacks to creating higher performance standards is this idea around cost and how it makes the building prohibitively expensive to build, or it makes the unit no longer affordable because it raises the price of the building. So I'm just wondering, maybe if all three of you could maybe touch on that from your perspectives, Brian, as financing a project, and then Libby and Ben from your perspectives as well. And how do we create a new narrative around that? What truth is there in that, and how can we address that? And after that, I'll send it to Howard for his question.
And are you addressing that to which person?
I think if any and all three of you would like to kind of touch on it, because I think it's the number one thing that we hear anytime we bring up the idea of creating better building stock with new builds especially.
Well, I think that I'm hoping that through this project we can get the numbers back and start to have real discussions about what it took to make this housing work. And I know one of the biggest people we have to convince is our state senator, Mr. Draheim, who is trying to reduce the standards on building codes because it was a quote unquote burden on the construction industry. And but you have to look at life cycle costs, the overall costs, the resiliency of the buildings. And this is something that we're making an investment over a long period of time. And somebody with a higher pay grade than me needs to look at how the numbers really work and how that affects from what the community pays for its housing over the life of the housing. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Libby or Ben, do you want to add on anything?
I can add on, and I apologize. Well, I had my colleague decided to wake up, but it's just, you might hear some grunting. I concur with everything that Brian said. Senate Republicans in particular are looking at the regulatory environment, and it's not just around the energy code. So there might be, it's a part of the mix, certainly. And I think that is one place where the House DFL as well as Senate Democrats have been very firm This is not an area where they're interested in budgeting or negotiating on, because they see that the long-term investments pay for themselves, as well as there's an equity issue. So ensuring that everybody can benefit from buildings that are performing well, and again, addressing this cost burden issue. I think the biggest thing is the funding, especially for affordable housing. Affordable housing developers can get on board. They are on board. Architects are on board, but it's a matter of, don't make me go after 15 different sources of funding and have this source be the source that is asking me to go above and beyond the energy code. Like, I just want one source and I will build what needs to be built, but I need the money to do it.
That makes sense. Thanks, Libby. 15 different sources of funding sounds untenable.
A related question to that one too, just because of the.
Hey, so, sorry to interrupt, Sean. I just want to give Ben Rabe a chance to respond to that question too. Thanks.
Oh, just to echo what Brian said, is that a lot of the particularly changes to the building code are offering paybacks between 6 and 12 years, and we'd all hope that these buildings would be around a lot longer than that. So, it's I think specifically referencing Senator Draheim, I think there's a lot of political posturing happening there. And that the benefits definitely outweigh the upfront costs, and that comes true in the analysis, or comes out in the analysis.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to pass it to Howard, who put his hand up.
Yeah, this question is for you, Ben, and it's really a softball question, because I'm a supporter of the Hillcrest Village in Northfield financially, as well as appreciating all the work that my friend Brian has done on it. Can you explain who or what is ASHRAE and why we should trust them? And who or what is IECC and why we should trust them?
Yeah. Oh boy. That is a softball to a certain extent, but it's also a very complicated question. These are membership organizations that come to what they recommend as their model code through a stakeholder process that becomes very politically entrenched. So we get things, for example, that don't end up in state codes, like the requirement for sprinkler systems in McMansions, I'll say. I mean, their houses over giant houses that don't actually get adopted in state code, but we see things like the sprinkler industry or the piping industry have a lot of outsized influence on these groups. That said, they have a diverse range of members that make recommendations on a consensus basis. So that said, they require a certain level of trust, but the state adoption process is there to make sure that things are definitely done in the best interest of us. And Fresh Energy is currently involved in both.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Howard, is that you satisfied with that?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks so much. Beth, got your hand up?
Yeah, thank you very much. The city of Northfield's also working on a sustainable building policy right now that we hope to have adopted fairly soon. And that, because we can't go higher than the building code, there has to be a financial incentive in order to require that. And so that, would be TIF or some other funding options from the city. One of the questions that came up at our, as we were sharing this with our Housing and Redevelopment Authority, was concerns about how this could affect low income and affordable housing. We are going to be offering developers a choice of third-party rating systems, green communities being one of them. So I guess my question is just sort of like, have you seen this be an issue around affordable housing now that most of our projects that we have given TIF type funding to, my understanding is, have been private developments. Some have been nonprofit. So I guess there's a difference there.
Anyone want to jump in?
I guess I could throw out the example of St. Paul's green building policy, which maybe points out some differences between St. Paul and Northfield, that the majority of buildings receiving funding and therefore being eligible for St. Paul's policy and necessitating the SB 2030 requirements are affordable housing. A lot on the university corridor, I guess all over the city, but there's a definite density on University Avenue. And one thing I heard that I will credit the author is Kurt Schultz, who manages that program, has said that it's not, in terms of equity and justice, why should folks living in these buildings have substandard building requirements than those who can afford it? So we know that their health and safety impacts are tied to having higher performance buildings. We know that energy burden is really hard on under-resourced communities. So we see this as part of our kind of equity and justice lens, not fighting against it on the original cost.
Thanks, Ben. We've got about just a few minutes more. I wonder if we could identify, this is a bonding year. Are there like 3 big things about bonding that we can think about? And then we also had a question, are there 3 to 5 legislative or administrative acts that would make affordable housing more climate friendly? So shall we take bonding first? Top 3.
So Kathleen, could you
There you
explain a little bit more about what?
So Sarah Wolf asks, how can we work together to help the bonding bill incorporate net zero buildings for affordable housing, so we can reduce the energy burden for those living there, as well as greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I can't speak, so I don't track some of the other components of the larger bonding bill very closely. I've been very narrowly focused on the housing infrastructure bond and what are called POP for public housing. We are asking Homes for All, which historically is the primary coalition advocating for those bonds, is going to be asking for a significant amount this year. We as a coalition haven't come up with a final number, but the past 2 sessions, it's been 500 million. I mean, that alone would enable Minnesota Housing as an agency to prioritize projects that, so there's an administrative advocacy component to it and how they allocate those resources. But so that's primary. I don't see a path forward this session on anything around net zero, just with the Senate Republicans. That doesn't mean it's not valuable to introduce and have a conversation about, but I don't see a path forward with that. Because I think there's also in the affordable housing world, there's been talks as a part of the Homes for All coalition at least about, this being the year to have eligible use around deeper affordability without supportive services. Just getting at more building for these households at 30% of median income as the primary focus, because we can't even do that, let alone add in additional requirements. So I think that's just context that's helpful.
That is helpful. Thanks, Libby. Ben and Brian, we only have a couple minutes left, but I guess, yeah, if you want to distill down any like particular policy or change that you think would make your work easier, would be a big win for climate and affordable housing.
Well, I don't know if I don't think this falls into the bonding year, but education of the trades in our local area technical colleges is a big thing for me in many ways, and I think making those opportunities available to our BIPOC communities is important to do that. And I know there are different groups that are working with community energy that are doing that independently, but I think our trade schools are important, and getting education about building buildings that are to this higher standard. Those are the, you know, the younger people that you want to get in and understanding it, because, you know, traditionally when you go out in the trades, you get out there in the field and the old guys are telling you, well, we've always done it this way. And, you know, a story that about ASHRAE is that all of the residential building contractors use the Model J or Manual J by ASHRAE, which does not work for high energy efficiency buildings. So we have to explain to these heating and contractors that we have to use different modeling methods to make these buildings work and to understand why we're doing triple pane glazing and why we're doing walls that are R30. So this education piece is absolutely huge right now in the beginning.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. That makes sense. Ben, Rabe, do you want to jump in and then we'll wrap it up shortly after that?
I think Brian's comments were a great place to leave it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to Libby, Brian, and Ben for your time and sharing your expertise. We really appreciate you being here and getting this conversation going. And we hope to continue the conversation amongst all of our communities. I'm going to pass it back to Kathleen.
And thanks to Anna, my partner in crime here, in setting all of this up today. Thank you so much for your work, and for Minnesota Environmental Partnership, which the Energy and Climate Cluster sort of initiated this question for today. And let us know if you have follow-up comments or questions. I think our emails were in the bottom of your Zoom info today. And thank you all for coming.
I'll send a note about the inclusive financing docket to everybody. And then the opportunity to get involved with more of the federal funding and cities and counties using it. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah. Thanks all. Thanks for being here. Appreciate you.